Okay, so our speaker today is Orlando, who is a second-year PhD student in that science. He's going to talk to us about coral reefs.
Yeah, that's just about it. So Yovna will recognize this screen because this came from a conversation we had what feels like years ago now, because it was in fact years ago. But it's a lovely depiction of sort of the problem and the pertinence of my research. So if the screen spans the entire world's oceans, then that little red square, which is about 0.1%, would cover the total area of coral reefs. What's the total area of rainforest? Any ideas? Okay, well, much more than that. But they're very similar in that they support a huge amount of biodiversity, about 25% of the ocean's fish, which rely on healthy reefs for breeding grounds and sheltering food. So given how similar they are in terms of structure and biodiversity, as forests, I hope you'll see a lot of parallels between this research and your own. Specifically, the research looks at how reefs are changing with the climate and how we can understand and forecast these changes in order to hopefully inform more effective conservation and adaptation measures over the long term.
Just a quick pause, Orlando. Maybe you want to sit over there and then we can
see us both at the same time.
Exactly. It's a laptop, so you can actually do that.
It's cool. That's amazing. But as a quick spoiler, what we're seeing is known as tropicalization, which is where corals are slowly, emphasis on slowly, migrating poleward, while the ones left behind sort of die as temperatures get worse around the equator. But taking a step back, for people who don't think about corals their entire life, why is it slow? That's because corals are animals, technically living in symbiosis with plants, algae called zooxanthellae, and they're not like other animals. They're very slow growing, they're sessile, so they're anchored to the bottom, where they build calcium carbonate skeletons, much like trees lay down bark. When you have lots of corals together, when those conditions for growth are suitable, you get reefs. One coral is not a reef, multiple corals are a reef. It's this whole structure rather than individual corals which deliver the ecosystem services that we associate with these reefs, including coastal protection, a source of food and of biodiversity, and also of income through tourism and medicinal value and things. So in the sense that a coral is like a tree, the migration of reefs is like the migration of a forest. It would be very slow, fragile, and only possible if there's sort of a critical mass of movement rather than just individual trees popping up as conditions become suitable. Like forests, reefs are also visible from space in these beautiful arrangements. So visible, in fact, that at the turn of the millennium, a cohort of very patient experts spent months, years, painstaking annotating imagery from Landsat and ZMULT satellites to outline the entire distribution of the world's reefs, which is a bit like, drawing around all the rainforests on the Earth. But of course, just like they're impacting the rainforests, we've heard how climate change is increasing temperatures and acidity beyond coral survivable thresholds. And we see this bleaching effect, which is basically a suicidal self-protection mechanism where corals expel their algal components and they end up losing color, hence the bleaching, and also their source of food. And if that stress continues for long enough, then they'll eventually die and get covered by algae, as we see here.
So the algae leave and then they come back again?
Different type of algae. Sorry. So you have these special symbionts, which are the zooxanthellae within the corals themselves. You can see those, that's what gives it their color. But you have sort of bad algae, which is like monoculture grassland compared to like an old-growth forest, which then basically coats the tops, coats the outside of these coral, which makes it very hard for it basically outcompetes new coral recruits. So it's hard to restore. And the ecosystem services offered by this sort of degraded reef is fractions of percentages of like a healthy reef and what they can do. And over time, with more and more wave action, because these things are no longer living and growing, they'll get eroded, and you'll basically end up with just rubble fields which can't support it. That would be like ending up with yeah, all the trees fall over and you don't get that complexity or the leaf canopy or anything that would support a forest. So I've gone completely over optimistic here, and prepared like a few pretty distinct kind of points of interest that I've been looking at over the last year. The main one, kind of partitioned in how long I'll spend on them, is the habitat distribution modeling. But also, I think the remote sensing part will be very interesting for people here. And if we have time at the end, we can talk about a meta-analysis. But what I really love is basically a sanity check and comments and queries and suggestions and heckling on the work in progress. Especially I'm coming up to the 18-month mark. So I'm sort of also evaluating directions for the second half of the PhD as I wrap up these projects. I also, for each of these areas, have a direct question for the room, but please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'd value more discussion than just getting through this stack of slides. But first, going to the habitat distribution modeling. First question is basically, do long-term climate models contain sufficient signal to predict shifts in environmental suitability for reefs? And if they do, can we predict these shifts on spatial scales relevant to reef distributions rather than just saying within this 1 degree by 1 degree area, what's sort of how much more unsuitable is it going to get? And we want to do that so that we can use these indications of long-term suitability to actually spatially optimize conservation responses. I think this is slightly akin to the motivation of, for example, the life metric, where you're looking at where you can manage interventions to maximize kind of the long-term future impact of maintaining biodiversity. Coming on to data, we have our ground truth that I've mentioned so far, which is basically this presence absence of this habitat, forest or not forest, coral or not coral. And we also have depth, which is super important because they focus in size, they're very depth limited to about 50 meters or so. In terms of environmental variables, our best understanding or prediction or hope for the future and for the past comes from CMIP on a global scale, which has a number of variables which are relevant to reefs at quite a coarse temporal and spatial resolution, but back to 1850 and up to 2100. So for each of those variables, we have our time series, and as I mentioned, we also have our ground truth of where we see reefs today.
Sorry, is ground truth like a year, like a continuous yearly map, or just from like 2001?
Great question. Yes, it's literally it's a snapshot, and the idea is that these historic conditions represent conditions that are suitable for those ecosystems to have become established in the longer term and have survived. You can also go much further back and look at the fossil records and see how these things have shifted around. But given that the first record of bleaching was like the late 80s, we're sort of tipping past that threshold now into unsuitability. But this is making the assumption that for the sort of earlier part of the century, for example, we had sort of more stable climate conditions which were within the suitability envelope.
And when is the ground truth from?
Yes, about 2001 or so.
Okay.
But it doesn't have to be, which is that second point about the coastal remote sensing. To basically more update and improve on that.
You said presence absence, you also had age, how old?
No, that's a really interesting sort of question to ask of reefs, because unlike a forest which just grows up and stays, with reefs it's a continual cycle of death and overgrowth, because you have corals which can live for decades or even for hundreds of years, like with trees, and then when they die, they basically, I'm going to go so off track. When they die, they basically they hold that shape and then gradually they crumble because they're no longer reinforcing it, like we're not reinforcing our muscles as we grow ourselves, and then they get kind of drawn apart by coral eating fish and by waves, exactly. And then you have a certain type of algae which itself is calcifying. It's making that calcium carbonate structure, which basically cements that dead rubble, that dead skeleton together, and in effect just looks like rock. And that rock is then overgrown by new coral recruits.
Okay, no, the reason I'm asking is that let's say in 2000 you were told, that there was coral presence, and you knew it was, this particular coral goes back continuously for, let's say, 200 years or 150 years, then you can use the 1850 records to correlate with that, whereas if it's only there for 20 years, you can't use the 1850 records. So you know how far back you can essentially extend your presence absence records to the past by knowing the age at that time.
Yes. Yeah, very fair. People do cause of
Of course,
reefs,
that's what I thought.
and you basically see, you see like laterally, you see growth of the skeleton year by year, like with trees, but also like linearly, you see the layers of.
But do you have the data for that?
Cores are incredibly expensive, very sparse.
Okay.
And
Basically,
no.
okay, got it.
Basically no.
Okay.
But I mean, for the introduction of the whole thesis, it's basically involves mapping, sort of doing a big review of where people have taken cores and mapping those to climate records in those regions to show that one relates to the other.
Okay.
Thank you for the questions. Please keep them coming.
I have one more.
Yes.
Handcall.
Yeah, brilliant. I thought that would be more shouting, but I will do.
So when you talk about long-term stability of the baseline conditions, how long is that? Like, is that 100 years? Or are we talking about 1900? Because if you go like more than 200 years into the past and you get into Little Ice Age, it's much colder. Then you go to now and it's warmer. Then what is the baseline?
Yes, baseline is the big question. CMIP, for its sort of high resolution, high spatial temporal resolution data is limited to 1850. Yes, there are sort of paleo models which go further back than that, but I'm sticking to the models which have the same resolutions in the past and the future, so that you can do a sort of a decent mapping from hindcast to forecast. So it's basically assuming that for the first 50, 100 years of that region, before you start increasing temperatures, you're in that sort of baseline suitability. So not going back too far, about a couple of 100 years, but yes, the Ice Age is an interesting one, and I can come back to that. But moving on, the idea of all of this is that you then can apply what you learned about your environmental suitability in the past, just making note of the decision, to your IID conditions from the same models in the future, and combine it all together in a sort of classic supervised learning, what you saw in the past to what you see in the future, and try and look at where those reefs might be able to survive sort of decade by decade up to 2100, which is the limit of the the CMIP future. Although more and more that feels like it's just right around the corner.
One more question. Are you treating all these coral reefs as exactly the same thing? As like exactly the same kind of forests? So if anyone's in Australia like a certain kind of condition, you're just assuming that all of them would like that kind of condition?
No. This shows a like the bird, well, it's called the meow, which is wonderful. It's the marine ecoregions, oceans of the world or something. So you basically have these, which are like the whole realms, and you also have the smaller ecoregions. So yes, very good question. And the ground said, obviously, you have different like pools of shared genetics and things around your corals, which are a result of currents and location. So it would basically involve, right? It's crazy to draw boxes around these things, but you can also go smaller in terms of like more local ecoregions. And so I'd be basically taking that as a feature into the model itself, or separately training models like on each ecoregion to account for that sort of diversity. As well, something I'm considering is using parameters actually of diversity, like to basically as a proxy or so for like adaptability. On the grounds that if you have lots of biodiversity, it's much easier to share and evolve and overcome stress and things. But that's slide 75, Johanna, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so how do you deal with this? How do you think about this change in suitability? You have lots of different methods with different complexities. Simplest one, bioclim, is literally what are the thresholds of survival in each variable. But it's super simple because it ignores the many interactions and correlations between environmental variables. So I'll just skip straight on to ecological niche factor analysis, or ENF, and go into a bit more detail. Because what this does is takes into account more the correlations between those variables. And what you do is you basically create a multivariate space where each axis is an environmental variable, and you account for the correlations between those variables with the sigma, with the covariant matrix. And what you're doing is still determining like your envelope of environmental conditions at which reefs occur, which I've called reference points. Anyway, and then you calculate the multivariate mean of those conditions, that mu there. And what you end up with is basically a multivariate centroid, like in 2D it would be an ellipse or so, or a wiggly thing, but then in higher dimensions it's some other shape. And then for each point x, for example, in the future or outside of your reef regions, you can pass in the vector of environmental conditions at that point and determine the distance away from that centroid in multivariate space.
So I mean, the distance that's used here is called the Marvin-Lewis distance. I
Yes.
don't know if you're using that or not.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. I found that it's perhaps sure, yes, exactly the same thing.
Okay.
I just thought it was easier to think about it as just kind of mathematically rather than introducing it as this concept, because it's very simple.
Sure.
And of course, the higher the Marvin-Lewis distance, the sort of the more unusual you are, or the further away from that survival optimum. And you can turn this on its head and calculate basically for any point the probability of observing a distance sort of as large or larger than your other distances, which gives you your p-value. So just as a little result so far for that, God, this is grainy. On the top, you can basically see how, and sorry for people online, in the equator, you can see sort of these equatorial regions becoming darker and darker as you go throughout the to the end of 2100, which accounts for regions becoming more and more like unsuitable for survival. And interestingly, you can also see the spread of sort of lightness up towards the poles as basically you get temperature shifts and light shifts and things. Well, temperature shifts so that higher latitudes become increasingly suitable for survival.
Question.
Yes.
Does unsuitability, is that just points that are very distant from the suitable regions in this, the way you're framing this right now? Or for bleaching events or death or in the unsuitable?
No, this is purely in terms of distance.
Okay.
What I'd definitely like to do next is basically correlate this with like frequency of bleaching events and see if they do correlate, or at what spatial scale they do correlate.
Because I just keep thinking like if it's just an absence of a coral somewhere in that kind of range of environmental conditions, does that mean it's unsuitable for them, or they just never went there?
Exactly, yes. That's a great point on the grounds that we're basically taking like time step by time step sort of snapshot of environmental conditions. But of course, there are areas or regions that they would just have never had a chance to get to, because much like pollination happening by insects or by like breeze in the ocean, it's entirely dependent on currents and sort of where things can disperse to. So yes, on top of this, talking to some people in Oxford who do very high resolution like current maps to then sort of superimpose that onto this, so that to combine environmental suitability and how much of a chance they had to actually get that in the first place. So basically
To just quantify uncertainty essentially around your unsuitability.
Yeah. And for sure, so this is red presence. There are, for example, off the west coast of Africa, this looks very suitable, but there isn't any reef there. And that does indicate kind of missing variables in the actual model. For example, like the benthic type might not be suitable for things to settle on, or more likely, you just don't get the currents going where you want them to on the ground. So if you think about the prevailing sort of circulation there, it's going from here. You barely get things in Bermuda because it's so difficult to get to. And so by the time any poor coral doesn't go to the Caribbean and stays on the way as a polyp, it's just going to die off the coast of Spain before going back to West Africa. So yes, that currents is a big thing to manipulate it with. That's it. And it's reflected on the bottom where you see basically a spreading out of your distribution and a decrease in suitability in the center as time goes by. I'm not going to talk about regression methods, but you could do linear regression or linear regression plus of just fitting splines instead of individual coefficients. More interestingly, I want to talk about some ML methods, and specifically the one I've found most useful, which is XGBoost, everyone's favorite random forest algorithm. I chose XGBoost as opposed to neural nets or Bayesian stuff, just on the grounds that it's good at, it's pretty robust to overfitting. It's very simple, and for sort of conservation reasons, I'd like to keep the models simple rather than making it too black box. But diving into what we did, basically a space for time substitution. Everyone familiar with that as a term? Shake or heckle otherwise? Okay, cool. And parameterize our time series with seasonal means and spreads and things. And this is what we end up with, which looks half decent. It's a weak predictor. It's not a perfect one-to-one fit. There's a lot of spread around that line, bless you, which is accounted for at least, well, largely by the fact that there are, like, it doesn't explain all the signal, these variables. There are ones which are missing in terms of.
It's a pretty high R.
That's really good.
Yes, yeah, wait for it, don't worry. Yeah, it's suspiciously good, you could say. But so it seems to be doing okay with not accounting for some things because of missing variables such as benthic type, or the fact that it could never have got there anyway. This is a case study on the Great Barrier Reef, which was chosen just because it has, like, if I wanted to ground truth against other data, then that's a really good place to do it. And also it has a range of reef types.
What is it you're predicting here?
This is, thank you, this is like reef density. So we have that presence absence, and I just basically my mind's gone blank. Went from 30-meter reef presence absence to like proportional coverage over like kilometer squares.
Wow.
To get an expression of density.
I see. And you just input is just environmental variables that you have.
Yes.
And you're just trying to predict the density of coral based on that map.
Exactly.
So is it live coral or dead coral?
So reefs in themselves are a mixture of coral and algae and other things.
Okay.
And sort of as they stand, yeah, it's coming back to that sort of long term.
Okay, because it's just coral presence, absence, ground truth at kilometer pixel scale.
Yes, exactly.
But they could be all bleached out and you wouldn't care.
Yes. This is training and testing on like the start. This is from 1900 to 1950. So hopefully environmental conditions which are slightly
So this is not looking in the future at all. This is just past. You already know the past. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. So just coming back.
The one map.
Yeah. So coming back to the space for time substitution, trying to build a model that could infer future temporal changes by training and testing, by looking at present day spatial patterns, using the assumption that basically that we can see how a reef is distributed across places that currently differ in environment, and think about then in future those environments will differ as well. So you're like, we can't see the future to validate it. So we need to see, okay, it's hotter over here, it's colder over here. Let's see if we can map across space.
That's not space for time as I understand it.
Yeah, I also have.
Space, no, space for time usually means that you have age data, and you take a snapshot and you say there's a 50-year-old tree here, a 20-year-old tree there, or whatever it is, and then at one snapshot in time. Right, and then you say in the future, this is what's going to be. So basically, the different ages at this over different spatial things can be translated into, for example, the age system. So what we did for Amelia's work on regrowth rate, right? We looked at all the regrowth rates as seen today, and they say, okay, but some of these are from events that happened 20 years ago, some happened 10 years ago, some happened 5 years ago. Then I can say, okay, this is the regrowth happens in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years from that event. So by looking at different time horizons in the past, when the, let's say, fire happened, I look at the regrowth, and the space for time basically is, I'm not looking at a single spatial point and looking at its temporal evolution. Instead, I'm looking at multiple spatial points with different events happening at different points in the past, and I'm going to smoosh them all together as if it was one continuous time series. So that's what I remember as, and there's similar analogies in computer systems which I used 40 years ago. So it's also space by time, but not what you're saying over here. This is what you're doing here seems to be correlating a temperature profile with a particular presence absence profile, and you're extrapolating the temperature profile to the future and extrapolating the presence absence profile to that future temperature distribution.
Yes,
But that wouldn't be space for time in my view. That would be
SFT, space for time in ecology is more like, everything else is the same, just the ages of the populations are different.
Right.
And you assume that they're identical other than their age or time since disturbance, and then you can plot a time series of age versus whatever variable you're, but that's just like.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly why I'm here and very useful. Thank you.
So you got your first heckle already.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, there's one for the heckle tally.
Yeah, there's a wonderful paper from the late 90s called Space for Time Substitution, like a tutorial. And when can you use it, when you cannot use it, and what does it mean exactly? What is the justification for it? There's a spatial homogeneity, it's a temporal homogeneity assumption that's sort of made, which is not always true, but you have to make it otherwise.
It turns out most of the time you can't use it, but people still do.
Exactly.
Because what else can you use?
Yeah, exactly. That's what the paper is all about. Actually, why shouldn't be using it, but people do anyway. And that's temporal homogeneity, exactly the assumption that the recovery rates are temporarily homogeneous over time. You don't have sudden bursts of growth, for example, that happen in one particular year, but not other years. But that would make it. So,
as you described it, yes,
yeah,
absolutely. That's what I'm doing. I should definitely stop calling it that. Thank you. But hopefully it makes sense, sort of what I'm trying to do.
Well, I mean, the assumption you're making here is that the temperature to presence absence data correlation, that mapping is time homogeneous. In other words, there's a change over time. However, I can give a plausible explanation why it wouldn't be true, which should be let's say there's a particular species which likes high temperatures, right? And at the moment, there aren't enough high temperatures around, so it's not very dominant in the population mix. But as temperatures increase, this particular species becomes dominant, or ecologically more dominant. And so as you get high temperatures, it actually becomes the dominant species. And if that happens, then the fact that right now at high temperatures we have low coral presence could change in the future. With high temperatures, you may have lots of abundance anyway because of different species taking over. In other words, you're not taking evolution into account.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
That's something I was hoping to do by incorporating the biodiversity data on top of that, but that does seem.
Yeah, but I mean, just biodiversity alone isn't going to give you the ability. I mean, it's possible that if you have enough biodiversity, you have also enough recovery, but it's also that's just a hope.
Okay.
But I think still you can make a claim about the existing species,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah,
can still
sure.
make a claim about feasibility of habitats for them.
Yeah.
But another way, as you say, it's not taking evolution into account, but this paints a sort of worst case scenario without evolution.
Yeah.
And I think that's useful enough in itself. We all said that it looks suspiciously good. Well, firstly, it's learning good things about the what parameters are useful in terms of finding depth and slope, very, very useful, and then caring a lot about temperatures, another couple of ecologically relevant parameters. It also looks too good spatially. You have good density reproduction and very nice capturing of the spatial variability. And yes, this seems incredibly suspicious. So I turned back to
Yeah, I was about to say, I was about to ask, what's your split?
of course. So spatial autocorrelation, basically, if your training and testing data are very spatially close, they'll likely have similar environments due to autocorrelation, so it will inflate your model scores. For example, coming back to forests, you might fit a model on forest in one part of a region, and then you might take 10 steps to the left and test it nearby, where the conditions are basically exactly the same. And your model will perform well, but it doesn't mean it would predict forests correctly somewhere far away or into the future. So it's a big issue. So to try and address this, I turned to variograms. Happy to talk about the maths, but in essence, what you get is a variogram describes how much two observations differ on average as a function of the distance, the separation between them. And if two nearby points have similar values, then this y-axis, its semivariance is low, like we see at very small distances. And as you increase the distance between your observations, semivariance increases until it sort of plateaus in this case, at about 4 degrees of lag. So at that point, you can basically say that the points to the right-hand side of this effective range sort of don't know, they don't have much knowledge of the sort of origin point to which they're being compared. And so that's a good sort of measure of maybe how you could do your train
It's
test.
4 degrees of latitude.
That's irrespective of latitude, longitude. That's just taking a circle around it. But yes, 4 degrees across the Earth.
4 degrees, so either latitude or longitude.
Yeah.
But wouldn't they be different in different parts of the world? And towards the North Pole, 1 degree of latitude, longitude is very small, and the equator is very large.
Roughly.
Yes, thankfully at the equator we don't have to worry about that too much.
Oh, I see. This is
Yeah.
mostly
they're
the
kind of-
equator.
Yes, I mean just by
If the world were a cylinder, that would be
Yeah,
good,
there are
okay.
no corals in the pool.
yeah, so corals are like plus or minus 30 degrees.
Okay, but even 30 degrees to 0 degrees
There's
is
some.
quite not bad.
And so all the CMIP data is on like curvilinear grids,
Okay.
and I've remapped it to basically regular grids,
Okay.
just because otherwise I would literally go crazy. But I'm happy to talk about that.
Okay, sure.
You can always be more conservative in terms of spatial autocorrelation. Whatever.
Sure.
So
Just
yeah.
double it.
Yeah, just to be safe.
Yeah, I mean, you could use what's called the Haverline distance,
Haversine?
Haversine distance, and that would be the Haversine distance, and that would be the right distance.
Mhm.
And then the distance then would be the Haversine distance rather than degrees, because any reviewer reading this is going to be quite upset.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Anyway, so that's one example for one time step in our area, and it's basically checking that it extends to other time steps. This is like the moving average of that effective distance.
Okay.
For
It can be as high as 6 degrees. Well.
Oh yes, yeah. But then we've got like if you look at, for example, like surface downward radiation, like it's even higher again because that's basically just a Gaussian across the Earth from the sun irradiance. But that doesn't matter because then anyway, that would be going too deep.
So you're not looking at like actual distances between your like correlations in your ground truth. You're looking at the correlations in your predictors.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, not in the ground truth.
Okay.
I haven't thought about that too much. But I would suspect at like 30 meters resolution, that would be very highly correlated. Whereas at this sort of degree resolution, they're not. That would be much lower correlated. But I should look at like Moran's eye, for example.
No, I'm questioning what I was doing because I kept looking at the ground truth correlations because I thought like some forests exhibit like larger patterns of spatial, like forests are and some are weaker in species. So I was looking more at like whatever it is that I was predicting. Like if, for example, if I'm trying to predict canopy, but it doesn't have any spatial correlation, like it's completely random in the ground truth, then it doesn't matter that my predictors are correlated, does it? Does it not?
Does this matter? Does anyone know?
I was just thinking about it. So if I mean ideally let's say the predictors are perfect predictors, right? Then if you know the predictors, then you know the output perfectly, right? That's why the perfect predictor is R squared of 1.
Yeah, okay.
Then any correlation in the predictors will be a prediction in the ground truth as well, in the output as well.
Right.
However, if the output is, if it's not a perfect predictor, you have some, let's say an epsilon noise term, then you're going to get something plus an unexplained noise, right? And that noise is going to have some behavior. If the noise is white noise, uncorrelated with anything, it's just some species variation, or particular tree has a higher height, or coral grows, whatever. Then there's no spatial autocorrelation for that, right? Then it doesn't matter whether you're doing the predictor or the
Yeah, but I'm saying like if some of your environmental variables are not relevant for corals at all, but they are very spatially autocorrelated.
Exactly. Then we don't care because
We
you're not
shouldn't
predictors.
care. So that's I'm trying to figure out which
Right.
one.
So if you go back to your previous graph showing the predictors, you had this graph showing this long thing. Yeah, the ones which are the feature importance, the ones that the important features are the ones that you want to probably look for. If you want to do correlation on the predictors, you should only look at the important ones. There's no point in looking at unimportant ones, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I still need to do some feature pruning as a.
I mean, normally what I would expect to see is like a PCA looking at the explainability of the outputs from the first K features. We have top 10 over here, but how much variability stretches are the top 10? That a PCA or UMAP will tell you. And then you can look at, if you want to focus on the autocorrelation or spatial autocorrelation, you should look at the spatial autocorrelation of the top 10 predictors.
Sure. Okay, so the top 5 are temperature, which is what
right.
This graph is, for example.
Okay.
So yeah, I started with that.
Yeah.
But point taken about the PCA for sure. Yeah. If you then look at how the accuracy changes, how you want to measure that with our test statistic, you see very high resolution, very close together train tests split with very small train test division. You get basically accuracy decreases as you go further, as you make more space between train and test.
The accuracy goes down to 0.2.
Yeah, it goes down to nothing. Well, yeah, terrible.
Okay.
At 10 degrees.
I mean, that's kind of expected, right? You're making it harder, so performance worse.
Yes, very expected, but whether you can then do anything at all with that result is a very, very fair question.
In other words, if you discount, if you choose far enough points, then the predictors basically are not predicting anything at all. What you're doing here is what in a time series we call people call what's called persistence prediction. Persistence prediction is it just is the next value is the same as the previous value. That's a persistence prediction. And if you think you got a beautiful time series predictor, just try persistence. It almost always works. Because it has no predictive power whatsoever. Just says what is the previous value versus the next one. And that's what spatial autocorrelation is. That's temporal autocorrelation. The spatial autocorrelation is exactly the same as persistence. And what he's saying is, if we get to 0.2 with the 5 degree separation, 0.3 with the 5 degree separation, then your predictors aren't very good. Essentially, what you have is equivalent to persistence.
Yeah, for sure. So this is very concerning.
Okay.
But the question is like, what kind of distance do you want to predict for, right? Like that is the main question of like what you should be testing here is also what is the goal of this? Do you want, whenever you develop your model, to be able to say something about 5 degrees away? Or you only want to be able to say things about half a degree away?
So I only care about time, really, which
Mhm.
I think is an even more difficult.
Right, we didn't even get the time.
Well, yeah,
Technically, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm concerned about the validity of this method, to be honest, for predicting robustly the future stuff. I mean, people have used like Maxent, for example, and done this in this sort of area and in other areas, and sort of not mentioned autocorrelation and just kind of gone forward.
Right.
And said, okay, this is what I think about the future. I think I've slightly shot myself in the foot by being like, hang on, that doesn't, I don't trust that, and then delving deeper. So I'm just seeing whether there's any way I can either dig myself out the hole or point out the hole for other people.
So you haven't yet done the temporal. This is still in the same map, right? You're just like looking across that one snapshot of whatever the environmental conditions you had in that 1 year.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't have a map here of, unlike the Mahalanobis distance, I don't have, going into the future, I don't have this model applied to the forecasted data yet. This is all present data.
No, that makes sense.
All present data.
Why would you do that if you're not
Exactly.
confident in your model for
That
1
was
year?
logical.
Yeah.
So we can like swipe from side to side and see that it changes in terms of like certainty and prediction, in terms of how high density it thinks there is there, but it still does retain the like the spatial structure fairly well, which is interesting, and something to be vaguely hardened by. But basically, in my dive down this rabbit hole, I'm now thinking about like different ways to buffer, for example, the train and test split. And as you can see by making a hexagonal map, I'm going slightly crazy with this. So
that's exactly what I needed. If you enrolled all the code for dividing the world into hexagonal cells, which took her forever to do. And you may as well use her code because she's done it.
too late.
Too late. She spent a lot of time, like 6 months, building hexagonal maps of the Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was she using like a regular grid as well?
For the Amazon, yeah, she ended up doing a hexagonal grid because she wanted to prevent all this erosion effects.
No, we have to be able to come up with like what you should be doing here. I mean, I can't like, but I think this is a very important topic. I kept talking about this also.
You're going to do this reading rumors.
Yeah. I wanted to do a reading group correlation. So, but I think this is super important because we're all predicting something environmentally, and if we don't have really a notion of what are we like, it's not just about getting a good number for a prediction. Who cares if it's not actually useful? So I don't think you have shot yourself in the foot. I personally think you're doing the right thing by asking these questions, and people who are not are just, I don't know why are they even researching? I don't know.
I mean, it entirely depends on like the actual task you're doing, right? Because if you're doing interpolation.
Okay, sorry. We should let Emilio say something. He's been writing a lot of messages. Emilio, please unmute yourself.
Unmute really quickly and say one that I think the sense that Orlando is using for this space for time distribution is concordant with how species distribution modeling thinks of this, which is basically that you have a homogeneous relationship between predictors and response through time, and that the spatial distribution or like spatial variation captures that. Second, that there's this method implemented in this R package cast, which looks at trying to match the distance over which you're going to extrapolate using cross validation. So the points that you have, and it's one way of thinking about capturing spatial generalization. So I link that in there as well. So it's an alternate way than like these grid blocking methods, which I've also been using, which I think often end up being too strict. They make your performance seem really bad because you're making the model extrapolate over really large distances.
Do you want to get a drink?
Sure.
Nice.
He's put some stuff in the meeting chat, which you should be, also should be on your.
I also want to come for that trip.
What's your about and Bria.
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you all. This is very useful, and I'd love to keep the conversation because I'm sort of in earth sciences where no one thinks about this, and it's been quite a battle to.
No, I obviously don't think the answer here is kind of what Amelia is saying, like, oh, you just predict 300 miles or whatever, 1,000 miles away from there. You're just then completely predicting in a different place, different ecosystem, like that kind of generalizability. You're asking your model to extrapolate from the place that where it was trained, and you cannot.
No, but that's not true. He's training across the whole world with these distances. So if you go back to the previous map, you've got circles all over the world, not just in that one region. So, yeah, you look at that. It's got all over the place, right?
So the tip of Australia, but yes.
Yeah, but still, the point is that it's not that you are only learning you're not in the auto distribution because it is the whole.
But if you can guarantee that these training samples are actually actually properly, you're sampling your your test and train are coming from the same distribution.
That's right. So we need to make exactly. So this underlying distribution shift there are I completely with you. But I think the two different things going on. One is distribution shift, the other one is spatial auto-correlation, right? And to the extent that there isn't a distribution shift, but there's only spatial auto-correlation, then you're fooling yourself, right? But if you are going distribution shift, then you're out of luck. You can't do anything anyway.
I mean, I guess what you can do is, well, measure that distribution shift, and maybe split your data by environmental niches.
Exactly. You showed that earlier, right? Those different regions. I think you were asked earlier about you said the four ecological zones. So you got to do your test train within that zone, otherwise you're in the distribution shift.
Yeah. Although this case study is just happening like in this.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not leaving that anywhere.
No, you're not leaving that. Although there are significant latitudinal differences along that way because they're responsive.
Okay.
To that.
Sure. Okay.
But that sort of comes to the end of that first section. That's F5.2. But basically, do they contain sufficient information? I think from the Mahalanobis distance and some of the machine learning, yes, to some extent with big caveats which need ironing out. Can we predict them on spatial scales relevant to reef distributions? If we can iron out 0.1, then yes, like you do get that sort of very homogeneous reef structure recreated at 1 kilometer resolution. And then the idea of all of this, which I haven't even started thinking about, or rather I've talked to quite a few stakeholders who are like, yeah, this is really cool. Come back to us when you have some maps, basically. But obviously, I'd be terrified to do that without ironing out points 1 and 2. I will just say, I'll stop pretty much now. But there were these other things. The coastal remote sensing, I think, is a really interesting one, where basically we tried to do fractional habitat mapping of these reefs using hyperspectral 270 wavelength band images, and it's a super difficult challenge because sort of just skipping around my slides here. It's a very tricky problem because it's a fun one. You have all this stuff in the way. You have the atmosphere between your sensor and the water. You have the interaction of light with water, and then you have the water column itself, which is incredibly spatially homogeneous in terms of clarity, which affects like the backscatter and the attenuation in our water. And what you're trying to measure is the reflection off the bottom. But for a bit of simple remote, simple again, random forests, my romance apparently. If you can use a multivariate sort of random forest predictor to do fractional mapping, which is sort of okay. The whole data set I was working with is a hot mess for reasons I do not have time to go into, obviously, but would be very happy to. But that seems optimistic. And what I would hope is that what would make it even better and generalizable would be if rather than taking like a single composite like median snapshot, which this data isn't even, this is just a flyover of a plane. If you took a composite, then that might make it better because the image quality will be better, and hopefully the atmospheric correction will be better because it was terrible in this data set. But maybe even better than that would be that if you have, for example, a whole time series of those images which have been smashed together to make magic numbers which do fun things, then you might be able to do fractional cover better in a sort of updatable way, which could also be used to indicate things like reef health or bleaching. And so
You mean you want to do coral habitat map?
I want to do coral habitat map. Please let me do coral habitat. Exactly.
Join our habitat meeting,
habitat
mapping.
I would love
Why
to.
don't you come to the July 14th workshop?
Yeah, why don't you come?
I would
And
love
we
to.
can get Frank to get some water representation before he leaves.
I'll stay post representation.
I don't know actually.
Okay,
It's like,
I think it goes about 10-20 kilometers off the coast.
Oh,
Yeah,
perfect.
pretty much, yeah.
that's all you need.
Okay.
Pretty much.
If you can send the ROIs for some of your Australian coast tips in it to Frank.
Sure.
And then
Yeah.
come to the July.
Great. Australia and Bermuda, because that's where this project was.
But we need to do a field trip to the Bermuda side.
To verify.
It's what I did last year. I'll send you.
Oh, right. Oh, you already did it. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. But I mean, I have a whole talk on that, basically, about the trials and tribulations of that data set and what I would hope to do with it instead. But yeah, basically, loads of stuff to talk about with the habitat distribution before it's in the state that I'd be happy writing it up. Can foundation models basically overcome the fact that every hour by hour, week by week, the water column basically changes its opacity and things as things flush through it. So you basically end up measuring the water column rather than what's on the bottom. But maybe if you basically see that whole time series of how it changes, you can extract something pertinent about what's on the bottom.
Don't be high hopes up too high because every 5 days. It's not. It's very very slow time scale, and we get only about 70-ish at best at the equator. And if it's cloudy, you don't get anything at all.
Sure.
So it's worth a shot, but I wouldn't be too.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Water seems also like just especially hard because I had like waterlogged regions that just still the model bunkers.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the
Estonia.
Estonian stuff
Yeah.
is terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So apparently every April they've got like the entire thing turns into a swamp and the water reflectance goes off the satellite reflectance and it doesn't generalize very well.
For sure, but given that people are trying to make these maps with single satellite composite images and saying, look at this incredible map we've made, this is complete trash. But for example, this was Bermuda. I'll just do this transition to end. This is Reefs from space going into Bermuda. Your field trip site will be camped out there at the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. Lovely access to the reach. This is Edinburgh. Yes. They tried to make these maps and said, look at these incredible things. And that is just with a single like composite image from Planet actually. So I think no hopes, but should be able to hopefully do better or at least explore it.
But the planet would be what, 50 centimeter resolution?
No, 3.7 meters.
Okay.
And
Still a bit better than what we have. It's 10 meters.
sure, but I did actually look at so I emulated the other satellites like
Okay.
wavelengths. So this is,
Oh.
you're welcome. So this is the very high band thing.
Yeah.
And you get comparable
Okay.
with others. So it's not too bad.
So Sentinel-2 is
So 13 band, yeah.
be possible.
Ish.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and also you were just trying the composites or something?
All this was doing was basically I had basically the pixel-wise map of all like 270 images, and then I just applied the like the spectral profiles of the different satellites
Mhm.
to those that band to see like through sentinel size.
I see, I see.
So yeah, then I did a whole meta-analysis thing, which is
But I have a quick question about your ground truth data set from 2001. How is that labeled? Is that like actually field data gathered, or did they sit over Landsat data and labeled it?
they did that.
Landsat.
Sentinel and Landsat.
Sentinel.
When did Sentinel start? Was it just?
215.
Oh, fine, sorry. Yes, Landsat 30-meter stuff.
So then if they did that, did they like then later extrapolate these maps for the future? Do we have current then? Like, because if they can use Sentinel, if humans can use Landsat to say where the corals are, then well, a machine should be able to use Landsat to tell where the corals are.
So they use Landsat to say where the reef is, which is sort of akin to saying, I can see this kind of fuzzy bunch of trees.
This is a segmentation problem essentially, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
But I'm just asking, like, if humans did that in 2001, then can we just use that as a labeled data set to train for Landsat for the next 20 years and have 20 years of coral maps?
The thing that they're measuring is it's like reef, like habitat area, rather than like specifically where coral is also. So this is sort of like a conservative label of that whole kind of habitat region, rather than like where coral is living.
But does the habitat region look distinct from somewhere that wouldn't be suitable for habitat? Then, like, if it's some kind of geographical label, then would you train a segmentation model on it?
Yes, and that has been done, and that's just like that label isn't going to change very much.
No.
Because it will, like, the things will die and they'll end up covered in turf, and then they'll just look like rock, and they'll look sort of the same. Anyway, I don't want to go over time, but thank you.
Okay, thanks for the random. Let me stop the recording here.